Thank you all for being here. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome today as we talk sports. Everybody knows, and I get kidded a lot about using sports stories and quotes, and even in my classes, people sort of roll their eyes when I start telling sports stories. Well, today I'm proud to introduce the person that is my number one sports source, the person that when I have a sports question that I call or email or ask for advice. It's appropriate today, I think, that we have this discussion because so much is talked about college athletics and the challenges, and on this day where we're all stunned by the news of the Ohio State tackle who was battling a concussion and apparently called or emailed his family and said he was sorry that he had a concussion, and then apparently had a self-inflicted gunshot wound as a result of that. And we've all seen all the various injuries and the demands and the challenges in college sports. J.R. Carroll graduated from the University of Arkansas, got his degree in accounting, went on to get his law degree, developed a specialty in commercial litigation, named to Arkansas businesses 40 under 40, really became a specialist in sports law and became an agent where he has dealt with employment and endorsement related issues. And he has some very strong feelings about the role of colleges and in particularly the relationship to their athletes. He is really a very talented person. I got to know him several years ago. He and Blake Rutherford were in law school together. And since that time, as I've said, he's become my sports source. Please welcome University of Arkansas Adjunct Law Professor J.R. Carroll.
Thanks, Skip. Thank my beautiful wife, Amy, for coming with me. It's one of those deals where after you've been married for about 11 years, there's a little voice in your head and it says, now who should I thank? Who should I not forget? And while Skip might have some pull on Pennsylvania Avenue, he has no pull on Maywood Street in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And so this is my power broker. As Skip talked about, there's been a shift in the way that college is, whether we should pay student athletes, whether we shouldn't pay student athletes. And it always seems like there's a stain to it when you talk about whether we should compensate athletes. There's been a massive landscape change in 2014. And it's basically the NCAA is fighting three battlefronts. And these three battlefronts, either one of these three are fatal to the NCAA and their defense of whether they should pay college athletes. And this lecture isn't about whether I believe college athletes should be paid or shouldn't be paid. But what it really is telling you is this is what's going to happen. It's inevitable. Now, these three fronts, all of which the NCAA are going to lose, and they're in the process of losing. And the first front is, are these student athletes, are they students, or are they college employees? The second is, for the longest time, colleges have been using the name and likeness of individuals without compensating those individuals. And last, the sheer economics of today's college football, basketball, etc. The money has gotten to be so big, and the pie has gotten to be so big, that at some point you're going to have to give a piece of that pie to the individuals who are actually generating that income. Now, whether this individual is a student or whether he is a college employee, came to the forefront in front of the National Labor Relations Board in the Northwestern case in March of this year. But to get back to that point, we have to see how do we get there? And Walter Byers, the first director of the NCAA, in the 50s, he was fighting this battle. He was getting these cases from these football players saying, I have a workers' comp injury, I was injured on the field. And he needed a defense. He needed something that said these people were students. They're not pay-for-play athletes. So he came up with the term. He just made it up. And to tell you how effective this term was, 60 years later, in the Ed O'Bannon case that I'll talk about, the judge that ruled against the NCAA used that term 253 times in her opinion. If you want to know whether you have, in the immortal words of Gordon Gekko, made perception reality, if 60 years after you created a term, a judge uses it against you 253 times, then you actually have created the defense that you wanted has worked. And that term was student athlete. What he did was he said, no, it's not an athlete for pay, it's a student athlete. That was a name that was just made up. And the other person that played an extremely big role in this case, in this issue, regretfully so, was a man named Ray Denison. September 26, 1955, Ray Denison played defense for Fort Lewis College. He was playing Trinidad College. Halfback went around to the side. He attempted to tackle him. Halfback's knee hit Denison's skull, cracked his skull, fell into a coma, died a couple of days later. What happened next? One little thing about Ray Denison, he was on school on a GI Bill. He also had a wife. He also had 3 kids. He was 26 years old. His wife files for death benefits under Colorado's Workers' Compensation Act. The NCAA and the university says he's a student athlete. The judge, in ruling in favor of NCAA, and is one of the landmark cases that they will use for the next 50 years, says there's no contract. There's no contract between Mr. Denison and the college to play. Secondly, and listen to these 2 next issues. Universities are not in the business of football. I think as a lawyer, it was going to be real hard in 2014 to go up in front of a judge and say, we're not in the business of football. The third reason, even better. It says, in today's business model, you cannot fathom how a university could either indirectly or directly profit from maintaining a football team. Think about those words, because in 1955, how could a university, support a football team? How could they ever generate money off of that? Well, so surely he's a student, not an employee. Back to the Northwestern case. Administrative law judge says he is an employee. You know why? There's a contract. Every year you sign a scholarship, and in that scholarship that you have to sign, it says these are the restrictions. You don't follow these restrictions, we take away your scholarship. I was talking to Skip about it earlier today, that we don't ever have a TV press conference when somebody signs a $50,000 emeritus scholarship to the U of A. But if a child gets a football scholarship, we're going to have cameras, we're going to have hats, we're going to have parents standing behind them, everybody's smiling. What they don't tell the parents and what they don't tell the news is this is a 1-year scholarship. It's not a 4-year scholarship. So you better play well, because if not, you're going back home if your parents can't afford to pay for that scholarship. I mean, that's frightening to think about it. What's more important, your academics or your athletic ability? Because they're telling you that it's a 1-year scholarship, so you better play well. Because what's it matter if you make good grades if you're not on scholarship the next year? The judge ruled that's a contract. What she also ruled was basically that these people were being supervised by non-academic individuals. There's no one in the faculty that's overseeing these kids. Secondly, they don't get any credit. You get 0 academic credit for playing football. And lastly, and probably the death knell, is you have football players on Northwestern's team. Some of them are on scholarship, some of them are not. The ones that aren't on scholarship can take classes that conflict with practice. The ones that aren't on scholarship can do a lot of things that they're excused from and is okay that conflict with their daily duties as a football player. The ones on scholarship are not given that same right. There is a quid pro quo. And so this happens in March of 2014. In June of that same year, Jim Delaney, the commissioner for the Big Ten, testifies in the O'Bannon case. It's an antitrust case for the name and rights of likeness of the players. And he testifies that basically, hey, we can't pay players. And if we do, there's going to be problems. And he makes the outlandish statement, if we start paying players, there's not going to be any more Rose Bowl. That was the famous quote that made all the headlines. It basically said, if the Pac-12 starts providing stipends to players and we're not doing it, then we're playing on a different playing field. It's not fair, and we just won't do it anymore. Ed O'Bannon case, they lose. The NCAA loses the case in August. And, basically what happens is, for the longest time, if you wear a Razorback jersey and you're photographed or anything like that, that is the ownership of the college. They don't have to compensate you for that. Judge Claudia Wilkins, in a 99-page opinion, a very well thought out, very succinct opinion for 99 pages, explains in details that that's no longer permissible and provides an injunction that says, NCAA, you cannot prohibit the universities and the conferences from paying these athletes. Now, I used to work for Bill Wilson, and Bill Wilson used to say, when you're drafting an opinion, he's like, keep it short and sweet, because the appellate courts are probably going to agree with how your decision, but they're going to disagree with how you got there. But she was able to write a 99-page opinion. And what she was able to do was she only focused on the issues that she had to answer. She didn't answer a lot of issues that she could have answered. One of the main issues was that the NCAA said, what about Title IX? If we have to compensate the name and likeness of X players because we use his jersey, then what are we going to do with all the people that we don't use their name and likeness? And what she said was, I don't care. You can figure that out. This is an antitrust case. I'm only going to answer these questions. 2 years ago, if you got on the NCAA's website and you typed in Johnny Manziel, a number 2 Texas A&M jersey would pop up for you to purchase. The NCAA and the universities have always taken the position that they do not use an individual's name and likeness. I think that's odd given the fact that if you did a search for Johnny Manziel, you didn't type in football, you didn't type in Texas A&M, you didn't do anything of that nature, but a number 2 Texas A&M jersey comes up. I have a 7-year-old son. His favorite number changes from day to day. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 11. He does have an affinity for the number 15 because he's around a very tall guy that wears number 15. But what is funny is if you go to the University of Arkansas bookstore, you can buy 0 jerseys, you can buy 1 jerseys, and you can buy 1 other jersey. And never has my child woken up in his 7 years of his life and said, Dad, my favorite number's 4, my favorite number's 7. He has never woken up and said, you know what, Dad, my favorite number today is 86. Why in the world would the University of Arkansas choose 86 jerseys to sell this year? Maybe because the best player on the entire team is number 86. But they wouldn't do that because they're not using the name and likeness of their players to sell product. Ask them. Ask the NCAA. They'll tell you the same story. What happened was, after they lose the O'Bannon case in August, and back to what happened with the Northwestern students, when they said, this is why we want to be named an employee. They said, these are the things that we think we're entitled to and we want. We want a 4-year scholarship. We don't want the threat of losing our scholarship hanging over our head. We want better medical coverage. What people forget is people think, well, if you're in college and you're on scholarship, then all your medical bills are covered. Not the case. Third, they wanted better concussion protocol. And, the universities and the NCAA, everyone said, we're going to fight this battle. After they lose these 2 cases, the Big Ten comes out and says, you know what we're immediately going to do in October? We're going to start providing 4-year scholarships. And we've got some recommendations to the NCAA. NCAA, hear us out. This is the same Jim Delaney that testified that the Rose Bowl was going to end. He said 4-year scholarships across the board, all universities. That's one of our recommendations. Second recommendation, we think that all the universities need to provide better medical coverage. Third, we think that there needs to be a stipend. And a stipend is basically, the NCAA limits what you can provide in a scholarship: books, tuition, room and board. Every university calculates what's the miscellaneous expense of actually just being a student. And that expense, depending on the university, is somewhere between $2,000 to $6,000 to $7,000. And lastly, what they said, what they want from the NCAA is to have scholarships for those individuals who leave school and come back. 7 days later, Minnesota states, we're going to start providing $2,000 stipends. The cost, the miscellaneous expense, basically what they call a full tuition expense, is $2,194. So we're going to start providing our student athletes $2,000. These are the first breaks in the dam to the NCAA where they're saying, NCAA, we're going to do this. Not to be outdone in the race to backtrack, Pac-12 comes out 7 days later and says, we'll see your 4-year scholarship. We'll do that. All these transfer rules that we have, we're going to do away with most of all those. We're going to also increase the medical coverage for the students exponentially. And lastly, we're going to provide $2,000 to $5,000 in stipends. And we're going to let the universities decide how much they want to give. It's going to be either $2,000 on the floor, $5,000 on the ceiling. University of Texas came out as well, and they said, we're going to start providing $10,000 stipend. And everybody kind of perked up and said, what did the athletic director for Texas just say? And so he came back the next day and said, that was misconstrued. I was asked a hypothetical question. I gave a hypothetical answer. And my hypothetical answer was, if the Ed O'Bannon case stays, then what I'm going to do is we're going to provide a $5,000 stipend for the miscellaneous expenses. And we're also going to put aside $5,000 in a trust fund if we use an individual's name and likeness. What that tells me is he didn't come up with these numbers on his own. The university has already had a roundtable about what are we going to do because we're losing all these cases. Judge Wilkins said basically, NCAA, you can no longer prevent them from paying you for name and likeness. We're not going to let students get endorsement deals. I'm going to prevent that. But what I am going to allow is the universities to set up trust funds no less than $5,000 for every year that a player is eligible. And after that person's eligibility is up, they can dip into that trust fund. Now, the last battle line that the NCAA is stuck with is the sheer economic interest that has occurred. ESPN aired the Alabama-Auburn game this weekend. Apparently, they thought it was such a popular game, they aired it on 2 different channels. I mean, I guess if you didn't want to watch it on one channel, you could watch it on another ESPN channel. Now, let's talk a little bit about Alabama. And let's talk about the profits that Alabama has incurred since they hired one individual named Nick Saban. The chancellor of the University of Alabama said it was the best investment that the University of Alabama has ever spent. And I've heard people say, well, they should say that they won 3 national championships. No, that's the short-sightedness of it. What he was talking about was return on investment. Since Saban has been there, the athletic department revenue has increased by 112%. That's since 2006. And I will tell you right now that Alabama did not have a small budget in 2006. So to increase by 112% is significant. You want to take the athletic part of it out to the side? The University of Alabama by itself, since Nick Saban has been there, has received over $600 million in private donations. Let's give you another stat. Since Nick Saban has been there, the student population at the University of Alabama has increased by 51%. So did a bunch of students just decide maybe Harvard, maybe Stanford, somewhere in the middle, Alabama? What's even more frightening, 62% of the students that go to the University of Alabama are not from Alabama. People from out of state, for some strange reason, have chosen that they want to spend 4 years in the state of Alabama. What's even better is there's currently 20,000 people, students, out-of-state students, that go to the University of Alabama. You know how much each one of those students in tuition alone pay more than an in-state student? $15,124. So every year, the University of Alabama in tuition alone is making roughly right under $300 million for the same tuition. This student just happens to be out of state, so he pays more or she pays more. And just so that it's not all about athletics, the application rate of people that are getting denied from the University of Alabama from the start of Nick Saban in 2006 to now is down 53%. The people that used to be able to get into the University of Alabama can no longer get into the University of Alabama. The demand to go to that school has increased for some strange reason. University of Florida hasn't been doing too well on their football team. The same time period of which Nick Saban has been the head coach at the University of Alabama, in which they've seen a 51% increase in population, Florida has seen a -1. And just so you know that it's not all about football, University of Alabama in 2012 had 241 National Merit Scholars. You know where that puts them on the list of public schools with the National Merit Scholars? First. They are #1 in the nation in public schools with the amount of National Merit Scholars going to that university. University of Kansas, studies show that they can expect a 7 to 8% bump in applications to their college when the Jayhawks make it to the Final Four or better. These universities have a vested interest in making sure that their athletic programs succeed and succeed at a high level. And if you think about $300 million a year in out-of-state tuition, think about all the extra money that goes into, a lot of you all have college students, all the money that you're pumping in to that city in that state for all the ancillary issues that go along with having a college student. $7 million a year seems like a pretty good bargain for Nick Saban. And so when the chancellor says it's the best return on investment that we've ever had in the school history, he's correct. And in conclusion, I'd like to say all of these issues that are pushing this to the forefront have all occurred this year. And as far as a lawyer, when you start talking about case law, when you say new case law for me is something that happened in 2000, 90s 2000. You know, when you're talking about case law that is occurring in 2014, you're talking about cutting edge stuff. We don't know where these things are going to go. Obviously, all these cases against the NCAA have been appealed. I think that they're going to have as much success on their appeal as they did at the lower court level. But what I'd like to say is, you know, we are not at a point where we have to think about it differently. We have to think about, you know, this can't be thought of as a way, it's in a negative light. Why are we compensating these student athletes? Judge Wilkins in the Ed O'Bannon case threw it back in the NCAA's lap and said, you do understand in your bylaws from 1956 to 1976 or 1975, approximately 19 years, they specifically allowed this full cost of tuition. And so basically what these individuals are asking for is exactly what the NCAA provided at one point in time. And I think what you'll see is you'll see stipends, and you'll see universities trying to decide how they should provide stipends. And I think what you'll see, you know, some type of collusion between universities that it won't get out of hand. Because more money that they take, I think that there's a concern that there's going to be an arms race, that the stipends are going to go, but I don't think that's going to happen. You know, my beautiful wife is a real estate agent. If you go into any city in any town, the real estate agent is, the fee is the same regardless of what real estate agency you go to. And I think that the same token with universities, that there'll be a unwritten rule as to what the limit of the stipends are going to be. And I thank you all for your time.
Good job. Thanks, buddy. Questions? Yes, and we'll get the microphone. Let's go right here, and then we'll come right over there.
Appreciate what you said. I have kind of a two-tier question. One,
Okay.
The private schools in the power conferences, how do you see them competing? And then you mentioned the Pac-12. I know Washington State and Colorado, their athletic programs have been operating at a deficit from what I've read. How do they compete with Oregon, where Phil Knight is such a benefactor for that university?
I'll take the first one, the second one first, and then ask me again about the first one, if that makes sense. Lawyers always try to make things difficult. You know, they're going to compete the same way that they have to compete with Ed Knight. You know, Oregon has waterfalls in their men's locker room. They have a barber shop in their men's locker room. Does that in any way, shape, or form help their ability to play football and or do academics? No. It's a competitive advantage. The University of Arkansas was one of the last schools, if not the last school, to have a basketball practice facility. That is an unfair, I mean, you can say it's an unfair advantage, but it's at least an advantage that the other schools had. And I think what's going to happen is they're going to say, you have the option to provide a stipend or not. Your choice. You can if you, because I think what's going to have to, the thought process is going to be that if you provide a stipend to the football team, you better be prepared to provide it to the gymnastics, you better be prepared to provide it to the track and field. It's going to have to be across the board stipend. So, but we're not going to make you do it. I mean, specifically, the NCAA prohibits Division III schools from providing any scholarships. You know, so, you know, we go from the realm of Division III, no scholarships, to Division I, you know, scholarships, and what's going to be on top of that scholarship. And I think that's really going to be for the universities to dictate. And I think that, you know, there is going to be some unwritten rule, if not an actual and express rule that says the stipend can't be, there's got to be some direct correlation between, because they all have studies. You know, they all know exactly how much. I think Texas's study shows that it's around $6,000. The miscellaneous expense between the grant and aid scholarship and what would be a full tuition cost scholarship would be.
Yes, question right here.
Having just come back from a weekend in the Grove for the Egg Bowl, this is certainly a timely topic. I haven't heard you mention the term athletic and professional. It used to be that those were the terms used to define whether someone was compensated. Has that fallen by the wayside, or is that still a measure at all?
It's not really, but it's also, how effective Walter Byers was with the term student athlete. I mean, I can't, even though I've tried to, differentiate between when I'm talking about an athlete that plays in college sports, the term student athlete just comes out of my mouth. And I think that there's been a conscious, veer off the word professional. Because if you think professional, it almost comes across as like a hired gun. And so I think that the NCAA has done a fantastic job with using the term student athlete.
Will the Olympics not still use those terms as far as qualification?
I think so. And the Olympics is a little bit different because you have individuals who actually, you have professional hockey players, you have professional basketball players that are playing in the Olympics. And so the Olympics have conceded that amateur issue.
Let me ask you a little off the question. What's the role of now television playing in college sports? You're seeing professional stadiums get smaller. How do you see 10 years, you follow this, how do you see college sports, particularly football, in the next 10 years?
I think that, you're going to have I think the main fan bases that have a massive population are still going to be able to fill their stadiums. But I think that, with the coverage and the convenience and everything else, you're going to find that, it has really hurt Major League Baseball. The attendance in baseball, while they like to promote their numbers, they promote their numbers as in tickets sold. They don't actually promote their numbers as to actually how many people actually go and attend the event. And you're going to see an increased, plus with the sheer cost that it costs for a family of 4 to 5 to go to a game, it is much easier with technology to stay home. And in fact, 49ers just came out with a new stadium, and their stadium, basically Jerry Jones went, big TV, everybody come see the TV. And the 49ers, who could have done the same model, but since they are in tech-savvy, Northern California, what they did was a very, come to our stadium, and we're going to be as iPad, phone savvy as possible. And so they've tried to really bring in all the technology that you could have so that you can talk about the game, you can tweet about the game, you can have all the personal convenience. Because if anyone's ever been to, like a University of Arkansas football game, it's very hard to make a phone call. It is very hard to use the internet. And the 49ers have done just the opposite. I think that they bring in 5 or 6 temporary cell phone towers.
Wow. Yes, sir. Question right here. Microphone coming right behind you.
So do you think that the stipends and the increased cost to players for Division I will end up killing Division II sports?
No, because I think it's going to be a much greater advantage than any advantage that Division I's ever had over Division II. But Division I over Division II still has, massive amount of advantage. I mean, take, for example, the Arkansas baseball team. It's one of the few baseball teams that when they travel, they get on a plane and then they travel. Almost every other school, especially a Division II baseball school, you're getting on a bus and you're riding 16 hours. All the teams that the University of Arkansas schedules in February and March for baseball, those are all mostly northeastern teams that get on a bus in Albany and drive all the way down here to play baseball. And, if you're recruiting a kid and you can say, hey, you can either ride a bus or you can get on a plane. T. Boone Pickens, one of the things that T. Boone Pickens does is OSU. The men's golf team, they have a private jet. Oh, by the way, the women's golf team, they have a private jet. You know, what kind of an advantage to that is you're trying to recruit a golfer out of Conway, Arkansas, a female golfer, and you're saying, our female golf team, you know, our commutes to the airport. And, you know, that's a huge advantage. And so is that advantage more than providing a kid $2,000 a semester more? Maybe, maybe not. But those advantages already exist. I talk to Division II athletes that say, you know, they're Division I athletes. They wear cleats for a day for one Razorback game, and then the very next day, there's a brand new set of cleats in their locker. Whereas they don't have the same, you know, they're not afforded the same abilities at Division II level. And so it just depends on, there's always going to be an advantage, and someone a lot smarter than me is going to have to decide whether that's an unfair advantage or just an advantage.
Alex, right here at the back.
Hello, thank you for coming out today to the Clinton School. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Being a part of it. There are many that have proffered or suggested that ultimately the NCAA is going to collapse under the weight of all this, at least where it relates to the high-profile sports like men's basketball, men's football, and that even the conferences may disband in some way, where the top teams in the SEC, top teams in the Big Ten, Pac-12, et cetera, will just form their own super conference, cut the middleman out of the NCAA, and then collect all the revenue that is generated from that. I guess my question to you is if you could respond to that, if you think that ultimately that's where all of this is headed, and if the NCAA can even prevent that, where I think there's clearly a lot of money to be made with top football programs in this case, and what do you think, how far away do you think that is, where schools might just get together and franchise themselves and cut the middleman out?
I really thought that this was an issue that would be handled quieter and more in-house than what it was. I mean, Mike Slive came out in the SEC Media Days and said, NCAA, you know, we're generating all the money, and we're giving it basically to you, and then you're disseminating it out to all the different universities, and we're not happy with our cut. I thought that would be a private phone call, and for Mike Slive to come out in the SEC Media Days and say, we'll just start our own conference if you don't fix this, means that things had gotten to a point that he felt like, you know, one, he felt strong enough in his position to make that comment because, you know, the NCAA has ruled the roost for the last 60 years. And SEC is king, at least in monetary. Which conference can generate the most income? And for the head of the SEC to come out and say, you need to do something differently or we're going to start our own conference, then, you know, I think that the NCAA, I don't think that there's much leverage that the NCAA has. I think that they have to make a lot of changes. And they have to, you know, the NCAA's big moneymaker right now is the NCAA tournament. But it's not near what it is compared to football. And the major football conferences can take that over and say, if you don't cut us into a bigger piece, then we're going to leave. I don't think that they'll ever leave, but I think what we see of the NCAA now will not be what we see in 10 years from now.
Any other questions?
Hey, thank you again for coming. Austin Harrison, Clinton School student. My question is kind of focused on this Power 5 conference and a Power 5 conference team's ability to pay that $5,000 stipend compared to a Boise State or Marshall who can only put up $1,000 a player. Does that not take them out of competition completely for the future of football because they can't pay these good players the same amount that an Arkansas or Ole Miss or Texas or somebody like that can?
I think it all still boils down to recruiting. You know, who's going to be the better recruiter? I mean, you know, your major recruiting, whether you give someone a stipend of $1,000 or $5,000, LSU, Florida, where the majority of the Division I, you know, LSU could say we're not going to give any stipends, and I don't think that there's going to be very many players at all that are going to say, instead of I'm going to go LSU's my home state. I grew up there. I'm purple and yellow through and through. But since I'm not getting $2,000 a month, I'm not going to play there. And so I think it cuts that out. I thought what was also interesting, and when Minnesota released their statement about providing stipends, and Texas did the same, without being, prodded to ask the question, they both said, and by the way, this won't affect our budget whatsoever, and we're not going to cut any programs. It was a sly way of saying, we got the money. Don't worry about us. I think Texas believes that if they give this stipend to every single one of their athletes, it'll cost them an extra $6 million a year.
Well, you can see why I enjoy talking sports with this guy, because he knows his stuff. And this topic, I think, is going to be one that's going to be at the forefront of football news and athletic news for the next several years. Let's thank J.R. Carroll.